transformational aspects of customers. Now I can present the next speaker from Oracle, Linda Jackson, a GVP Industry Strategy of Oracle, speaking about technologies and innovation for a coherent smart grid strategy. Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Robert. Good morning, everybody. And thanks for joining us this morning. I know it's always tempting to sleep in on the second day of a conference. I want to talk to you today, I suppose, and Marina said it, I think we could spend all day talking about the changes smart meters have brought about. We could spend a couple of minutes talking about the changes to the traditional CIS. Now we've moved to time variable pricing, net energy metering, and the prosumer market. We could spend another couple of hours talking about the emerging role or the emerged role of meter data management, that second generation that we've got, where it is the true enterprise system, whereas it always has been the purview of, I just need a meter data management system to get the bills out the door. Meter data or interval data has become an enterprise-wide thing. And so we could spend a lot of time talking about all of that. But what I wanted to concentrate on today was actually talk about something a little bit different with respect to the changing applications that are coming into the smart grid because of smart grid. And there's two particular that I'm going to talk about today. We could spend, and I know many of the sessions here over the next couple of days will talk a lot about analytics and the role of analytics. I'm not going to speak about analytics today at all, but we could, they're sort of some of the topics that we can see from a technology perspective and a provider of applications to utilities across the world. We could talk about all of those things, but let's just talk about two things in particular. First of all, there's the business issues that are driving the change. And so as you look at your application portfolio, you need to understand that there's new applications coming into that application portfolio. Marina spoke about one already, which is this whole interaction with the consumer that is so important as part of that engagement. There's also obviously the issues with this exponential growth in data. We hear about it from other industries. We're now, for the first time, starting to see that in the industry, in the utility industry. We're moving from just a transactional base to real time. Marina talked about time variable pricing. A lot of utilities, we're involved in a pilot with Pacific Gas and Electric in California with 200,000 consumers moving to actually real-time pricing, where we're notifying them on a 15-minute interval basis of what their consumption is. We also do that for the province of, a lot of the utilities in the province of Ontario in Canada, with utilities like Toronto Hydro and Enersource Mississauga, who've moved completely to real-time pricing for their consumers. That consumer engagement model is so important, as Marina spoke about. The other thing that we're seeing, and we're seeing this more often, and most of you probably think, what's Oracle doing in the technology space, in the application space around utilities, is we're seeing this convergence of information technology with operating technology. I was actually with a group of CIOs, Chief Information Officers last week, including guys from EDF and Enel, and they were talking about the fact that these two things are merging together. So as you look at your organizational structure and you look at the way the industry is developing, you need to notice that the traditional operational technologies and the traditional IT technologies are actually coming together quite nicely. So they're the sorts of things that we're seeing from a utility perspective driving the change around smart grid. But one of the key things that we've looked at just recently is the management of the smart devices. And so this is one of the areas of change. We've traditionally looked at the meter as a dumb device. It's an analog meter. It got replaced once every 15 years. But what's actually happening now, and I'm sure Enel can speak to this, I know this is an issue, and this is an issue coming out of the utilities in the US. It was a distinct demand brought to us by Pacific Gas and Electric, is this area around configuration management of the meter and of the meter software. And if I just illustrate, this is actually an example, a true example of a photo we took recently at a utility. This is how they were managing the configuration of their smart devices. This is actually switches and relays in a utility in the US. Obviously, that's not applicable. The cleaning lady, not appropriate. The cleaning lady comes in, she wipes the board clean, or he wipes the board clean, there's your configuration gone. So as you move forward in this smart grid area, what you need to think about is you need to think about new applications that are actually going to help you manage that. And this is a second example of, whereas traditionally with an analog meter, you've had one piece of software between the meter and the bill, effectively, which is the data collection software. That's the only piece of software you've had, and that was fairly easy to manage. But if you look at this example, and this is not a deregulated utility, this is a regulated utility example, it becomes much more complex once you get into a deregulated space. But you now have software that sits between, the meter has software, it has firmware on it, the communications that it has firmware. You have a data collector, has software associated with it. There is software in the head-end collection system. There is now the meter data management system, and then you eventually get to the CIS. If all of those things don't actually work in concert and they don't work together, you will actually not be able to get, A, the bill out the door on a monthly basis by accurate reads, or actual reads, not estimated reads, as Marina said, but you also won't be able to participate in real-time pricing. A consumer will expect that meter to work. If they're participating in a real-time pricing event, they will expect that meter communication to work every single time. So one of the things you need to think about is there's new applications emerging in this space, and that you need to use to actually manage that manage these devices. Those devices also traditionally don't sit, traditional meters never sat in your enterprise asset management system. You never kept a record of them. As they went through their life cycle, they were thrown on the back of the truck and then discarded and recycled. Now those meters are obviously a lot more valuable, and utilities today are struggling around how do they keep track of those assets. At Pacific Gas and Electric, they actually go onto eBay on a regular basis to see if smart meters are actually available, because they're concerned from a security perspective. So how do you control and log where all those devices are, how they're performing, and what their failure rate is? And so, as I said, when you go through and start to look at the technology associated with smart meters, you need to think about management of the smart meter and the device. You need to manage the firmware updates. You need to manage and understand where that device is located at all times. It is now a security device and can present a security risk. You need to understand, because it is a valuable asset, whereas previously a meter wasn't, you need to understand where it's been installed, when it's been removed, or where it's been exchanged to. You need to also calibrate it on a regular basis. Make sure that those firmware updates have taken and that you are actually recording correctly. There was recently a case in the US where the channels were not adding to the register, and 6,000 customers were billed incorrectly for a period of time. Once that correction was made, those customers got bills upwards of $6,000 for a period. Their traditional, it was a gas utility, their traditional bill was about $100 a month. All of a sudden, thump on the doormat goes the the gas bill, and it's $6,000. The actual commission that regulates that gas utility made the utility forgive that debt, because it was at the fault of the utility, not at the fault of the customer. And so they actually wiped $6 million straight off their bottom line, because they had to forgive the debt that they didn't, from those extended bills, because they didn't keep track of the firmware as it was and how it was operating within the meter. And so configuration is critically important. So when you go back to your utility, go back and talk to your meter team about configuration management and how you're actually achieving that within the realms of smart meters at the moment. But this also applies for anybody on the distribution side for smart relays, smart switches, all of the synchrophasers, all of those sorts of things. So again, not only is the hardware changing from a utility perspective, and we're seeing smart meters, smart switches, relays, DA devices, but we're also seeing new technology applications come into being. That's an example of one. The second example I was going to give you is actually relates, interesting enough, to what Marina said, is to do with distributed generation. The view in the marketplace today is distributed generation is the most disruptive technology being introduced to utilities across the world. Marina's nodding, so that's good. And you need to understand how that actually impacts. It impacts in a number of different ways. It impacts not only your revenue models. We've seen just recently coming out of California where they're installing, Pacific Gas and Electric, I'll just reference them again, they're installing 10,000 rooftop photovoltaic solar units a month. Think what that does to your revenue model. And they've actually now started to talk to the Commission, both PG&E, Southern Cal Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric have actually started to talk to the Commission about wanting some sort of relief around just the volume of photovoltaic solar that's being installed in the state of California. So that's the revenue side and the customer side. The customer wants to know what they're producing, what they're consuming, and how that all balances out. But those of you on the grid side know that it actually presents a huge issue for utilities. It presents a huge issue with respect to how do you manage the voltage fluctuation as a cloud passes across the area where those photovoltaics are actually installed. So from our perspective, what we've looked at is understanding how to manage those micro areas, and this concept of a microgrid or a distributed grid management software comes into being. The microgrid became sort of has been experimental. It's experimental, probably more advanced here in Europe than we've seen in places. We do have a little bit of it in the US. We're actually working very closely with San Diego Gas and Electric. They have an area outside of San Diego where they have a load issue where they cannot build further transmission or further high voltage into that area, and so they're setting it up as a test area for photovoltaic, for storage, for a little bit of wind, for biofuels and all those sorts of things. But again, this moves away from that traditional look that we have, which says we understand the network model. The traditional network model, the classic distribution system, is managed as a single point. It's got load break, so it's got transmission supply points, load break switches, and load flows one way. And that's what we see today, and that's where we are. All power supply comes from the transmission system. It flows only in one direction, and the losses are part of that transmission. What we're seeing with this local generation, we see the power supply changing, as you all know. It comes from transmission as well as embedded generation. The power flows are more complicated, and the entire system loses power if a transmission source is cut. And so what we're seeing now is this development of this second area of technology that you need to be aware of, which is this area around microgrids. And so there's a microgrid is this concept of distributed grid management and management of the grid in a different way. This is emerging. It's not there yet. We think it's probably got 2 to 3 years to run before we see wide-scale adoption. But we're actually actively working with utilities around the world to make sure that this is available. So the microgrid area contains both generation as well as load. The generation is located close to the load, and this is particularly important. We're working in India at the moment where they don't want to build large transmission, and particularly because of loss and of cost, and so they're positioning generation very close to the load. It requires a different management system. And so, in summary, as you go back to your utilities, you need to think about how this location of generation close to the load area is going to impact the way that you manage that grid. That grid is traditionally centrally managed. We're starting to see step away from that, and we're starting to see looking at this whole area of distributed grid management. So that's just, as I said, we could talk for ages about what changes you need to make to your CIS, what changes you need to make to your meter data management system, what big data is doing and how analytics is impacting the utility. But I just wanted to talk briefly today about how that application landscape is changing and new applications are being brought into the utility from our perspective. One on the operational device management side and the second on the distributed generation side. There we go. That's all I've got to say. We're trying to keep ourselves on time.
Thank you very much, Linda.
You're welcome.
Very good. Any questions from the audience?
No? Excellent.
It was quite clear, yes. I understand. Yeah. Well, so thank you very much, Linda. Now let me present